I am Gwen, 34 years old, and I am about to tell you how I legally dismantled my toxic former husband and his entitled new wife. When my former husband brought his new wife to kick open my front door and slam an eviction notice right into the center of my Thanksgiving turkey, she smugly announced that this house belonged to her father now. I could have pulled out my phone right then and showed her the documents proving I owned not just this house, but the entire private equity firm currently keeping her billionaire father from declaring bankruptcy. But watching her plan my public humiliation in front of my own family, I decided to let this play out. After all, I did not build a single financial empire by showing my cards to amateurs. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart people who thought you were beneath them. The holiday started like any other tense family gathering in the affluent Chicago suburbs. I was hosting Thanksgiving dinner in the 5-bedroom suburban house I used to share with my former husband David. The atmosphere was already suffocating. My parents sat at the mahogany dining table, picking at their food and dropping passive-aggressive hints about my perceived failures. They were desperate for a cash injection for their dying logistics business and had been furious with me ever since my divorce from David. To them, David was the golden ticket, because he had just been promoted to vice president at the Montgomery Group, a massive real estate conglomerate. My sister Rachel and her husband Jamal sat quietly across from me, the only two people in the room who actually supported me. Jamal, my African-American brother-in-law, caught my eye, offering a warm smile as my mother complained about dry stuffing. I was just about to pour myself another glass of wine when the heavy oak front door of my house flew open with a violent crash. The sound echoed through the hallway, making everyone at the table jump. Footsteps clicked loudly against the hardwood floor. Into my dining room strode David, wearing a smug grin and an expensive tailored suit that I knew he could not actually afford. Clinging to his arm was Brittany Montgomery, his brand new wife, and the pampered daughter of Richard Montgomery, the billionaire owner of the Montgomery Group. Brittany was wearing a white cashmere coat and carrying a designer handbag that cost more than most people make in a year. She looked around my dining room with an expression of absolute disgust, wrinkling her nose, as if the very air in my house offended her. My parents immediately dropped their forks and sat up straight, their faces transforming from sour disapproval to eager submission at the mere sight of the Montgomery heiress. "What are you doing here now?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. David crossed his arms, puffing out his chest. "We are here to deliver a message, Gwen." He stepped aside, allowing Brittany to take the center stage she so desperately craved. Brittany reached into her oversized designer bag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She marched right up to the dining table, ignoring the horrified gasps of my sister Rachel, and slammed the heavy manila folder directly onto the platter, holding my roasted Thanksgiving turkey. Gravy and cranberry sauce splattered onto the pristine white tablecloth, staining the linen. "Happy Thanksgiving!" Gwen Brittany chirped, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and pure malice. "Consider that your official notice to vacate." My father half stood from his chair, his napkin falling to the floor. "Notice to vacate," he repeated nervously. "Brittany, dear, what is the meaning of this?" Brittany did not even look at him. She kept her heavily mascaraed eyes locked entirely on me. "My father's company just bought up a portfolio of distressed mortgages from your bank," she announced loudly, ensuring every single person in the room heard her. "And guess whose pathetic little underwater mortgage was in that bundle? Yours. We own the paper on this house now." David stepped up beside her, wrapping his arm around her waist and kissing her cheek before looking at me with pure contempt. "The Montgomery Group is clearing out this entire neighborhood for a new luxury development," he stated. "And since you are technically in default on the latest property tax adjustments, we are accelerating the foreclosure." Brittany leaned across the ruined table, her diamond engagement ring catching the light from the chandelier. "You have exactly 24 hours to pack your cheap clothes and get out of my father's new development zone," she sneered. If you are not gone by tomorrow night, I will personally have the sheriff drag you out onto the street, and do not bother trying to fight it in court with whatever pennies you make from that failing little property management startup of yours. You are entirely out of your league, sweetie." I looked from the gravy-stained eviction notice on the turkey to David's gloating face and finally to Brittany's triumphant smirk. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought they had utterly destroyed me. What they did not know was that my failing little startup was actually a powerful front for Apex Holdings, a private equity firm that controlled over $2 billion in assets. More importantly, they did not know that I had spent the last 6 months aggressively and quietly buying up Richard Montgomery's high-yield mezzanine debt. Brittany was standing in my dining room threatening to kick me out of a suburban house, completely unaware that I literally owned the financial lifeblood of her father's entire empire. I glanced at Jamal, who knew the truth, and smiled. Let the games begin, I thought silently. Now I am ready to watch them lose it all. I stood up, the wooden leg scraping the floorboards. The sound pierced the silence that had fallen over the dining room. My parents held their breath. Rachel gripped Jamal's hand under the table. Jamal watched me, his dark eyes steady and knowing, completely unbothered by the theatrical display unfolding before us. I did not look at the gravy-stained eviction notice. I looked directly at the man I had once promised to spend my life with. David was a coward, disguised in expensive tailoring, and seeing him hide behind his new wife only confirmed what I already knew. "You brought her here to do your dirty work for you?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. I stepped around the ruined Thanksgiving table, my heels clicking methodically on the hardwood floor, until I stood just a few feet away from them. "You could not just send a lawyer, David. You had to make a spectacle of it on a holiday in front of my family." David stiffened, his jaw clenching as he stepped slightly in front of Brittany. "Do not try to turn this around on me, Gwen," he snapped, pointing a manicured finger at my face. "You brought this entirely on yourself. You knew this house was heavily leveraged when we finalized the divorce. You knew the bank was getting impatient. I am just ripping off the Band-Aid. Montgomery Group acquires distressed assets, and yours was sitting right at the top of the pile. It is just business." "Business," I repeated, allowing a small, humorless smile to touch my lips. "Is that what we are calling it now? Because I remember the divorce negotiations quite differently. I remember you sitting across from me in that mediator's office, swearing up and down that the house was a financial sinkhole. I remember you pushing that pen into my hand." David let out a loud, cruel, and mocking laugh that echoed off the high dining room ceilings. "Oh, please, do not play the victim now. You signed the quitclaim deed of your own free will. Nobody held a gun to your head." He was right about one thing. I had signed it, but I did it because of the elaborate web of lies he had spun. During the final months of our marriage, David had convinced me that his mounting debts were about to drag us both under. He played the panicked, failing husband perfectly. When the divorce proceedings began, he offered me a seemingly generous deal. He told me he would take on the massive burden of the house and all its associated debt, shielding me from bankruptcy. In exchange, all I had to do was sign over my equity through a quitclaim deed and walk away clean. He specifically framed it as a sacrifice on his part, a way to let me keep my small, struggling business entirely in my own name, without him fighting for half of it in court. "I gave you the deal of a lifetime," David boasted, his voice rising with arrogant confidence. "You were absolutely terrified of losing that failing, pathetic little investment startup of yours. You begged me not to touch it. I graciously took the house and its bloated mortgage off your hands so you could keep playing chief executive officer at a company that barely generates enough revenue to pay for its own office supplies." Brittany leaned her head against David's shoulder, giggling softly. "It is actually hilarious when you think about it," she chimed in, tossing her blonde hair over her white cashmere coat. "You traded $1 million suburban property for a useless little company. My father spends more on his weekly golf trips than your entire company is worth. You really do not have a head for finance, do you?" I kept my hands relaxed at my sides, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me clench my fists. "You lied about the property taxes, David," I stated calmly. "You deliberately let the payments lapse after the divorce was finalized, pushing the mortgage into default so your new father-in-law could swoop in and buy the debt for pennies on the dollar. You manufactured this entire foreclosure just to hand my home over to the Montgomery Group." David took a step closer, his face flushing with a mix of anger and triumph. "So what if I did? That is how real estate works, Gwen. The strong eat the weak. You were too stupid to see the play, and now you are paying the price. Giving up your equity in this house just to protect that worthless business was the absolute stupidest mistake of your entire life. You essentially handed me the keys to your financial ruin." He was practically vibrating with malicious joy, feeding off the power dynamic he thought he controlled. "You are a failure, Gwen." He spat the words laced with years of built-up resentment. "You could not keep your marriage together. You could not figure out how to satisfy your husband. And now you cannot even keep a roof over your head. You gave up a guaranteed home for a pipe dream, and look where it got you. You are 34 years old, completely alone, and getting evicted on Thanksgiving." The cruelty in his voice hung heavy in the dining room. My parents remained absolutely silent, staring at their plates, implicitly agreeing with his assessment of my life. They had always worshipped David's corporate title and despised my entrepreneurial risks. "You really think you won, do not you?" I asked softly, tilting my head as I studied the man I used to love. "You really believe you outsmarted me?" David sneered, wrapping his arm tighter around Brittany. "I do not just think it. I know it. The paperwork is filed. The eviction is legal. You are officially homeless as of tomorrow night. I highly suggest you start packing your cheap clothes right now, instead of standing here trying to act tough." I turned away from David's triumphant smirk and looked toward the head of the table. My parents were sitting perfectly still, their plates of turkey and stuffing completely forgotten. This was the moment they were supposed to stand up. This was the moment they were supposed to defend their daughter against a man who was publicly humiliating her in her own home on Thanksgiving. I waited for my father to rise from his chair, to tell David to get out, to demand respect for his family. I waited for my mother to unleash the sharp tongue she so frequently used on me, against the intruders who had just ruined our holiday. I waited, but they did nothing. My mother's eyes darted between me, the gravy-stained eviction notice, and Brittany's expensive cashmere coat. My father cleared his throat, adjusting his napkin with trembling hands. I could see the calculation happening behind their eyes, weighing the value of their daughter against the vast wealth and influence of the Montgomery Group. "Mom," I said, my voice steady, but carrying a clear plea for backup. "Dad, are you going to say something to them?" My mother finally moved. She stood up abruptly, the chair legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She did not look at David. She did not look at Brittany. She walked straight toward me, grabbing my elbow with a tight, painful grip. She pulled me roughly away from the center of the dining room, practically dragging me into the adjacent kitchen and pushing the swinging door partially closed behind us. Her face was flushed not with protective anger, but with sheer panic. "Gwen, are you out of your mind?" she hissed, keeping her voice low so it would not carry back to the dining room. "Do you have any idea what you are doing right now? Stop making a scene." I stared at her, genuinely struggling to process her reaction. Making a scene. "Mom, my former husband just broke into my house on Thanksgiving to hand me an eviction notice. He is trying to throw me out on the street, and you are worried about me making a scene." My mother squeezed my arm tighter, her fingernails digging into my skin. "Keep your voice down," she commanded, her eyes wide with desperation. "Do you know who that girl is? That is Richard Montgomery's daughter. Do you have any concept of what that man could do for our business? Your father and I have been trying to get a meeting with Montgomery Capital for 6 months. Our logistics company is drowning, Gwen. We are 2 bad quarters away from filing for bankruptcy, and a single investment from Richard Montgomery could save everything we have spent 30 years building." I pulled my arm out of her grip, stepping back as if she had burned me. "You cannot be serious," I whispered, staring at the woman who raised me. "You want me to roll over and let them take my home so you can pitch a business deal to her father?" My mother's expression hardened into the familiar mask of disappointment she wore so well. "Look at the reality of your situation, Gwen. You are losing this house anyway. You signed the paperwork during the divorce. David outsmarted you, and now you have to deal with the consequences. But you do not have to drag the rest of the family down with you. If you throw a fit and make an enemy of that girl, her father will never even look at our proposal. You are being selfish. Selfish." The word echoed in the quiet kitchen. I had given up my equity in this house specifically to protect the business I was building, a business they constantly ridiculed. Now they were demanding I surrender my dignity so they could beg for scraps from the very people trying to destroy me. "Just apologize," my mother pleaded, her tone shifting from angry to desperate. "Go back out there. Apologize to Brittany for raising your voice and tell them you will be out by morning. We can help you pack. You can stay in your old bedroom at our house for a few weeks until you find an apartment. Just do not ruin this opportunity for your father and me. Please, Gwen. Save the family's reputation." I looked at her, realizing with absolute clarity that I had no family left in that dining room, save for Rachel and Jamal. To my parents, I was not a daughter in need of protection. I was an obstacle standing between them and a billionaire's checkbook. The kitchen door suddenly swung open, hitting the wall with a soft thud. Brittany stood in the doorway, a patronizing smile stretched across her face. She had followed us, listening to every word of my mother's desperate betrayal. "Oh, please do not stop on my account." Brittany laughed, stepping into the kitchen and leaning casually against the granite island. "I have to say, Mrs. Miller, you are much more practical than your daughter. It is refreshing to see someone in this family who actually understands how the real world works." My mother immediately straightened her posture, smoothing her skirt and arranging her face into a fawning, eager smile. "Brittany, we are so sorry about this disruption," my mother stammered, stepping toward her with a sickeningly sweet tone. "Gwen is just feeling a little emotional, but she completely understands the situation. We were just discussing the logistics of moving her things out tonight." Brittany inspected her perfectly manicured nails, pretending to consider the offer. "You know, my daddy is always looking for new logistics partners for his development projects. He values efficiency and people who know how to solve problems quickly without causing a fuss." She looked up, her gaze locking onto my mother. "If you can guarantee that Gwen is entirely packed and off this property by midnight tonight, I might just be willing to put a good word in with Daddy about your little shipping company. I cannot make any promises, of course, but he usually listens to me." My mother's eyes lit up with sheer, unadulterated greed. Midnight, she agreed instantly without even glancing in my direction. "Absolutely. We will have her out by midnight. You have my word, Brittany. Thank you so much for understanding." Brittany smirked, turning her triumphant gaze back to me. "See, Gwen, that is how you negotiate. Maybe you should take notes from your mother. It might help that pathetic little startup of yours survive another week." She spun on her heel and walked back into the dining room to rejoin David. I stood perfectly still in the kitchen, staring at the woman who had just sold me out for a vague promise from a spoiled heiress. My mother would not meet my eyes. She grabbed a roll of trash bags from the pantry and started briskly walking toward the stairs. "We need to start boxing up the living room," she called out to my father. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the last remaining tie to my parents sever completely. They had made their choice. They had abandoned me to protect their own interests, and in doing so, they had unwittingly given me the ultimate freedom. I no longer had to hold back. I no longer had to protect them from the fallout of what I was about to do. I was completely alone in my own home, and it was the most liberating feeling in the world. I pushed the kitchen door open and stepped back into the dining room. The silence that greeted me was thick and heavy like the humid air before a thunderstorm. My parents were already stacking plates. Their movements were jerky and anxious as they tried to physically erase the Thanksgiving dinner they had just been enjoying. David and Brittany were standing by the entryway, watching my return with eager anticipation. They wanted tears, They wanted begging. They wanted to see me break down and shatter into a million irreparable pieces right there on my own Persian rug. I refused to give them the satisfaction. I walked calmly over to the table and picked up my linen napkin. I deliberately wiped the corners of my mouth. I folded the napkin into a perfect square and set it down next to my half-empty wine glass. My heart was beating a steady rhythmic drum in my chest, but my hands were completely still. I looked at my parents first. They averted their eyes and focused intensely on the leftover turkey. Then I looked at David. His smug grin faltered for just a fraction of a second as he searched my face for the devastation he expected to find. "You want the house?" I said, my voice smooth and devoid of any emotional tremor. "Fine, you can have it." The space was suddenly stripped of all its sentimental value. It was just drywall and wood now. It was a liability that had served its purpose. I walked past the dining table and headed straight for the hall closet to retrieve my coat. My sister Rachel stood up from her chair with tears pooling in her eyes. Jamal placed a gentle and grounding hand on her shoulder. He gave me a single, imperceptible nod. He knew the protocol. He knew we were entering the next phase of the operation. Brittany let out a sharp, victorious squeal that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She practically jumped into David's arms and wrapped her arms tightly around his neck. "Did you hear that, babe?" She cheered, her voice echoing down the corridor. "She is actually surrendering without a fight. Daddy is going to be so thrilled when I tell him we cleared the property ahead of schedule." David chuckled with a deep and arrogant sound that used to make me feel small. He reached over to the console table where I kept a decorative bottle of vintage champagne. It was an anniversary gift from years ago that we had never opened. He popped the cork right there in my foyer. The foam spilled over his hands and dripped onto the hardwood floor. It left a sticky puddle that I no longer had to clean up. I slipped my arms into my wool trench coat and buttoned it up. My mother rushed out of the kitchen, wiping her hands nervously on a dish towel. "Gwen, where are you going to go tonight?" she asked, her voice high and tight with artificial concern. "You can sleep in the guest room at our house. We can figure out the packing tomorrow morning." I did not even break my stride as I walked toward the front door. "Do not pretend you care now, Mom," I stated clearly while opening the heavy oak door. "Enjoy your new logistics contract. I hope the price of your daughter was worth it." I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind me. The heavy click of the deadbolt sounded like the closing of a vault. The cold November air hit my face instantly. It was a sharp and biting wind that swept through the bare branches of the suburban oak trees. The street was quiet and lined with parked cars belonging to families who were inside sharing gratitude and warmth. The contrast between their warm homes and the cold driveway where I now stood should have felt devastating. Instead, the icy wind felt like a baptism. It washed away the final lingering shreds of my old life and cleared my mind with absolute precision. I walked down the driveway with the gravel crunching beneath my boots. I felt lighter with every single step I took away from that house. I stopped at the end of the driveway and stood under the amber glow of the street lamp. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated my face in the darkness. I opened my encrypted messaging app and found the chat with Jamal. My brother-in-law was a brilliant African-American forensic accountant. He was a man who could track a single hidden dollar through a maze of offshore accounts. More importantly, he was my secret right-hand man. He was the only person besides my legal team who knew that I was the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. I typed out a single and precise message. "The bait is taken. Freeze the mezzanine debt of the Montgomery Group. Let us bleed them dry." I hit send and watched the message status change to delivered, then immediately to read. Jamal was already on it. Richard Montgomery thought he was expanding his empire by allowing his spoiled daughter to evict me from a suburban house. He had absolutely no idea that the company providing the vital mezzanine financing for his billion-dollar South Bay mega project was mine. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and hailed a premium black car service to take me downtown. I stood right there waiting for the vehicle to arrive while watching the faint glow of the lights coming from the dining room windows of the house I was leaving behind forever. I was entirely done playing the discarded and pathetic suburban wife for those arrogant and greedy people. It was finally time for me to return to the city and execute a truly ruthless hostile takeover. I smiled into the cold night air. The game had just begun. Perfect. The next morning arrived with a crisp and biting chill that swept off the lake and filtered through the bustling downtown streets. I woke up in my actual bed, a custom king-sized mattress situated in the center of my $5 million penthouse. The panoramic windows offered an unobstructed view of the Chicago skyline. It was a stark contrast to the suffocating suburban walls I had gladly left behind the night before. I slipped into a tailored designer suit that screamed quiet luxury. I left my building and walked 2 blocks to my favorite artisanal coffee roaster. The line was short, and the barista greeted me by name. I ordered my usual black coffee and handed over the standard debit card I still kept from my previous life. The card reader beeped an angry, jarring tone. Declined. Assuming it was a chip error, I wiped the card and handed it back. Try it one more time, I requested politely. The barista swiped the card through the machine. The same obnoxious beep echoed across the counter. I am so sorry, Gwen, the barista murmured, looking apologetically at the screen. It says the account has been frozen by the primary account holder. My mind immediately went to work calculating the variables. I pulled out my solid metal black credit card and paid for the hot coffee without another word. I took my cup, found a quiet table in the back corner of the cafe, and pulled out my phone. I opened my banking application and navigated to the old joint account. David and I had legally agreed to leave this specific account funded with exactly $15,000 for 90 days. It was a standard escrow hold meant to cover any lingering property taxes, final utility bills, and outstanding maintenance fees for the suburban house before the title officially transferred. I stared at the screen in absolute disbelief. The balance read 0. Looking at the transaction history, I saw that David had executed a wire transfer at 2 in the morning. He had drained every single penny into an offshore account and flagged the joint account for suspicious activity. A cold laugh escaped my lips. David was a senior vice president at a major real estate firm, yet he was petty enough to commit blatant wire fraud to steal $15,000 from a woman he believed was entirely destitute. He wanted to ensure I could not even afford a cheap hotel room or a warm meal on the morning after my supposed eviction. It was a pathetic, vindictive, and highly illegal move. He was handing me the exact ammunition my legal team needed to destroy him in court later. I took a screenshot of the unauthorized wire transfer and immediately forwarded the image to Jamal via our encrypted channel. I added a quick note telling him to log this highly specific transaction for the upcoming criminal fraud dossier. Just as I hit send, my phone began to vibrate violently against the wooden surface of the cafe table. It was not just one notification. It was an avalanche of text messages, missed calls, and social media alerts. The screen lit up with names I had not thought about in months. There were messages from the suburban country club, wives, the neighborhood association board members, and the local gossips who fed on other people's misery. I unlocked my phone and opened the first message from a woman named Carol who used to live 3 houses down from me. Gwen, we just heard the horrifying news, her message read. Brittany Montgomery was at the country club breakfast this morning telling everyone what happened. We had no idea you were struggling with such severe mental health issues. Please tell me you are getting the psychiatric help you need. I raised an eyebrow and opened the next message from a different neighbor. I am so sorry about the eviction, Gwen. Brittany said the inside of the house was completely destroyed. She said you had a total psychotic break and were hoarding garbage in the living room. If you need a place to stay or someone to talk to about your bankruptcy, my church group does charity outreach. I scrolled through dozens of similar messages. Each one contained a slightly different, increasingly insane variation of the same malicious lie. Brittany had wasted absolutely no time. Instead of simply enjoying her new house, she had marched straight into the most elite country club in the suburbs and launched a vicious, calculated smear campaign against me. According to the rumors, she was actively spreading over mimosas and avocado toast. I had completely lost my mind. She told the entire neighborhood that I was absolutely broke, mentally unstable, and living in filth. She claimed David had to hire a specialized biohazard team to clean up the hoarding mess I had left behind. She even told people that I was escorted off the property by psychiatric services in the middle of the night because I refused to leave the dining room table. The sheer audacity of her lies was almost impressive. She wanted to ensure that I was entirely ostracized, stripped of any remaining dignity, and universally pitied by the people I used to call peers. She thought she was ruining my reputation beyond repair. She had absolutely no idea she was just digging her own grave deeper. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the bitter taste sharpen my focus. I did not reply to a single message. I did not defend myself to Carol or any of the other gossiping housewives. Silence was my greatest weapon right now. Let Brittany paint me as a bankrupt loser. Let David believe he had stolen my last dollars. Their arrogant delusion was the exact blind spot I needed. I picked up my phone and typed a second message to Jamal. The narrative is set. They think I am completely destroyed. Prepare the financial trap and get the downtown penthouse ready. I will see you in exactly 30 minutes. I finished my coffee and walked out of the cafe, the crisp Chicago wind hitting my face. A sleek black town car was already waiting at the curb. The driver opened the door and I slid into the luxurious leather back seat. "Take me home, Arthur," I said. We drove through the bustling heart of the city, the towering skyscrapers reflecting the pale winter sun. This was my territory. While David and Brittany were busy reigning over their petty suburban cul-de-sacs, I had been quietly building an empire in the concrete jungle. The car pulled up to the entrance of a prestigious high-security residential tower in the Gold Coast neighborhood. The doorman greeted me with a respectful nod as I bypassed the lobby and headed straight for the private elevator reserved for the penthouse suites. I swiped my key card and the doors glided shut, whisking me upwards to my actual residence. The doors opened directly into my $5 million penthouse, a sprawling expanse of floor-to-ceiling glass, polished marble, and minimalist elegance. It was a world away from the cramped, dated suburban house David thought he was so clever for stealing. Jamal was already there, sitting at the massive granite kitchen island. He had transformed my sleek dining area into a makeshift war room. Stacks of thick financial dossiers, printed spreadsheets, and highlighted ledgers were spread out in organized chaos. Jamal looked up from his laptop, a sharp, predatory grin spreading across his face. "Welcome back to civilization," he said, closing a file folder with a decisive snap. "How was the suburban eviction tour?" I tossed my coat onto a nearby armchair and poured myself a glass of sparkling water. "Predictably pathetic," I replied, leaning against the counter. "David froze the escrow account this morning. He stole the $15,000. Jamal chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "He is literally handing us the rope to hang him with. It is almost too easy." He tapped a thick red folder sitting in the center of the island. "But that is just petty cash compared to what I found in here. I asked you to bleed them dry, Jamal. Tell me you found the artery." Jamal stood up and began pacing the length of the kitchen island, his energy palpable. He was in his element. Gwen, Richard Montgomery's entire billion-dollar empire is nothing but a masterclass in smoke and mirrors. He is not a titan of industry. He is a desperate gambler holding a terrible hand. I leaned closer, my full attention locked on his words. "Break it down for me." Jamal opened the red folder and pulled out a complex organizational chart, pointing to a massive project highlighted in yellow. "It all comes down to South Bay. Montgomery Group bet their entire future on this single mega-development. They promised investors a luxury waterfront paradise, but they vastly underestimated the construction costs, the zoning delays, and the environmental remediation required. They are bleeding cash daily. The project is billions over budget and years behind schedule." I studied the chart, tracing the flow of capital with my finger. If they are bleeding that badly, how are they still operating? How are they paying their contractors and keeping the facade intact? Jamal's grin widened into a full-blown smile. That is the best part. When the traditional banks realized South Bay was a toxic sinkhole, they completely cut off Montgomery's credit lines. Nobody on Wall Street would touch them with a 10-foot pole. So Richard Montgomery had to turn to the secondary market. He needed a massive immediate injection of cash just to keep the lights on and stop the whole project from collapsing into foreclosure. He sought out a high-yield short-term mezzanine loan from a private equity firm that prefers to operate anonymously. My heart began to race with the thrill of the hunt. Mezzanine debt is notoriously ruthless. It sits right below the primary mortgage, and if the borrower defaults, the lender does not just get their money back. They get the keys to the entire kingdom. They can seize the equity and take over the company. How much did Richard borrow? Jamal picked up a single sheet of paper and handed it to me. $500 million. He leveraged the entire Montgomery Group portfolio, including all their suburban assets, as collateral for this single desperate loan. He signed a contract with incredibly strict financial covenants, agreeing to exorbitant interest rates just to secure the cash. I stared at the number on the page. $500 million. It was a staggering sum, a financial anvil tied directly to Richard Montgomery's ankles. And who exactly was the generous anonymous private equity firm willing to take on such a massive risk for such a potentially devastating reward? Jamal leaned across the granite island, his dark eyes gleaming with absolute triumph. He tapped the logo printed at the top of the loan agreement. That is the cherry on top, Gwen. Richard Montgomery was so desperate for the cash, so blinded by his own arrogance, that he never bothered to look past the shell companies and the corporate lawyers representing the lender. He took the $500 million from Apex Holdings. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. The reality of the situation crashed over me in a wave of pure, unadulterated power. Richard Montgomery, the billionaire who allowed his daughter to throw me out of my house, was entirely owned by my company. Every brick he laid, every dollar he spent, every breath his empire took was completely dependent on my continued grace. Brittany had marched into my dining room and declared that she owned my home. She had no idea that I literally owned her father, her trust fund, and her entire future. I looked down at the loan agreement, my eyes tracing the strict financial covenants Jamal had highlighted. If Richard violated even one of these terms, I could legally pull the plug and dismantle his entire legacy overnight. The game was no longer about a suburban house. It was about absolute financial annihilation. I stood in the center of my penthouse, staring at the loan agreement that essentially handed me the keys to the Montgomery empire. Jamal packed up his forensic accounting files, his face glowing with the satisfaction of a hunter who had just cornered his prey. We had the exact leverage we needed to dismantle David and his arrogant new family. Just as I handed Jamal his briefcase, my phone began to ring from across the marble kitchen island. The caller identification displayed the name of my mother. A cynical laugh escaped my throat. I had fully expected absolute silence from my parents after they stood by and watched Brittany throw me out of my home on Thanksgiving. I picked up the device and pressed the answer button, placing the call on speakerphone so Jamal could hear the inevitable groveling or manipulation. I assumed they were calling to offer a hollow apology or to check if I was sleeping on a park bench. I was entirely wrong. Gwen. I am calling to discuss the annual real estate charity gala this coming Saturday, my mother announced immediately. Her voice was sharp, clinical, and completely devoid of any maternal warmth. You usually attend, but your father and I need you to stay far away from the venue this year. I leaned against the granite counter and crossed my arms. Why exactly would I miss this important networking event, I asked. The voice of my father suddenly echoed through the speaker, indicating they were on a conference call. Because David and Brittany are going to be there as the distinguished guests of honor, he stated bluntly. Richard Montgomery is receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award at the gala. Your mother and I have finally secured a brief window to pitch our logistics company to his investment committee during the cocktail hour. We cannot afford any distractions or unnecessary drama. By drama, you mean my mere existence, I replied, my tone dangerously calm. My mother let out a loud, exasperated sigh. Let us be realistic about your situation, Gwen. You are currently a homeless dropout without a marriage or a stable living situation. Brittany has already informed the entire country club about your mental breakdown and your eviction. If you show up at a high society gala looking desperate, it will completely humiliate us. We have spent months cultivating a positive relationship with the Montgomery family. We cannot have you wandering around the ballroom reminding everyone of past mistakes made by David. They actually viewed me as a stain on their social climbing campaign. You want me to hide in the shadows so you can beg a billionaire for a bailout? I summarized flatly. My father chimed in again, his tone dripping with condescension. We are asking you to do the right thing for the family business. It is a simple request. Stay home, stay out of sight, and let us secure our future. I looked at Jamal. He shook his head in absolute disgust. I turned my attention back to the phone. I am not staying home, I stated firmly. I have a ticket to that gala, and I have every intention of walking through those front doors on Saturday night. I will not hide from David, I will not hide from Brittany, and I certainly will not hide from you. The line went dead silent for several seconds. When my mother finally spoke again, her voice trembled with rage and entitlement. If you walk into that ballroom on Saturday, you will destroy everything we have worked for. Richard Montgomery will be furious if his daughter is upset by your presence. He will reject our business proposal. I am warning you, Gwen. Do not test us on this. You have already ruined your own life. Do not ruin ours. Your business is failing because of your own financial incompetence. I shot back, dropping the facade. Do not blame me for your impending bankruptcy. You stood in my dining room and watched another woman threaten me, and you did absolutely nothing. You chose their money over your own daughter. Now you want me to erase myself so you can kiss the ring of the man who is trying to destroy me. The answer is no. I will be at the gala. My father yelled into the phone, his voice echoing through my luxurious penthouse. You are an ungrateful and spiteful woman. We gave you everything, and you turned out to be a complete failure. If you take one step inside that charity gala and jeopardize our investment deal, you are dead to us. Do you hear me? I heard him perfectly. The threat was definitely not an empty one. It was the final brutal severing of our biological ties. My mother immediately backed him up, delivering the most devastating line of the entire conversation with precision. Your father is right, she declared. If you cannot respect our wishes and stay away from people who are clearly out of your league, then we have nothing left to say to you. As far as we are concerned, we have one successful daughter now. We have Brittany. She is the kind of woman we can actually be proud of. She understands business, she understands loyalty, and she understands family. You are officially on your own, Gwen. Do not ever call us again. The phone clicked and the room fell silent. They had just disowned me over a simple party invitation to protect a man I secretly owned. Jamal stared at the disconnected phone, raising a single eyebrow. Well, he said smoothly, I guess we are going shopping for a new evening gown. I smiled, feeling absolutely no sorrow. I was going to crush them all on Saturday night. The gala was no longer just a social event for me. It was going to be a battlefield. They wanted to pretend I was a complete nobody. I was going to prove I was the person who held all the power. I placed the phone face down on the marble island and took a deep, steadying breath. The silence in the penthouse stretched out for a long moment, broken only by the low hum of the city traffic drifting up from the streets below. Jamal watched me carefully from across the counter. He closed the thick financial folder he had been holding and rested his hands on the polished stone surface. Are you okay? He asked, his voice steady and grounded. I looked at my brother-in-law and let out a short, sharp exhale. I am better than okay, I replied. They just gave me the final push I needed. There is no guilt left to hold me back. Jamal nodded in agreement. He opened his laptop, the screen illuminating his face in the dimming afternoon light. Good, he stated simply. Because while you were dealing with that pathetic phone call, I was running a deep diagnostic on the internal ledgers of the Montgomery Group. I found something that is going to make Saturday night much more explosive than a simple wardrobe reveal. I walked around the island and pulled up a high-backed leather stool sitting right next to him. "Show me," I commanded. Jamal pulled up a series of complex spreadsheets. The rows and columns were highlighted in varying shades of red and green. When Richard Montgomery promoted David to Senior Vice President of Acquisitions last month, he gave your former husband direct access to the operational accounts for the South Bay Development Project, Jamal explained, pointing to a specific cluster of data. Richard trusts David completely because he is married to Brittany. But Richard clearly never bothered to run a background check on his new son-in-law. I frowned, leaning closer to the screen. David has always been careless with personal finances, but he usually plays it safe at the corporate level. What did he do? Jamal let out a low whistle, shaking his head. He got sloppy, Gwen. Really sloppy. Look at these outgoing wire transfers from the South Bay escrow accounts. Jamal highlighted 6 different transactions executed over the past 4 weeks. They were routed through a series of obscure vendors listed as construction consultants and environmental surveyors. At first glance, they look like standard operational expenses. Jamal continued, his fingers flying across the keyboard to open another window. But when you dig into the actual routing numbers, these vendors do not exist. They are phantom LLCs registered to a registered agent in the Cayman Islands. I traced the ultimate destination of these funds. David has been siphoning corporate cash directly out of the Montgomery Group to cover massive underground gambling debts. My jaw dropped. I stared at the screen, doing the mental math. David was always obsessed with projecting an image of extreme wealth, but I had no idea his vices ran this deep. "How much did he take?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. $2 million, Jamal answered flatly. He stole $2 million from his father-in-law in less than 30 days. He is drowning in debt to some very dangerous people, and he used the South Bay Project funds as his personal piggy bank. I sat back in my chair, processing the magnitude of this discovery. David had not just made a poor business decision. He had committed a major corporate felony. He was embezzling money from the exact development project that Apex Holdings was keeping afloat. My mind immediately jumped to the legal frameworks of the mezzanine loan I had authorized. "Jamal," I said, my pulse quickening with sudden realization. "Pull up the master loan agreement between Apex Holdings and the Montgomery Group. Navigate to Section 4, the financial covenants." Jamal typed rapidly, pulling up the highly classified legal document. He scrolled through the dense legal jargon until he found the specified section. "Read the material adverse change clause," I instructed. Jamal read the text aloud, his voice gaining momentum as the implications became clear. "The borrower agrees that any act of corporate malfeasance, fraud, or unauthorized diversion of funds exceeding $500,000 by any senior executive officer constitutes a direct breach of this agreement. Upon such breach, the lender retains the absolute right to trigger the acceleration clause." Jamal stopped reading and looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute shock and burgeoning excitement. "Gwen," he whispered, "David is a senior executive officer. He embezzled 4 times the allowed threshold. This is a direct, catastrophic breach of the covenant." A slow, predatory smile spread across my face. I stood up from the stool and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling city. David thought he had destroyed my life by kicking me out of a suburban house. He thought he had won the ultimate prize by marrying into a billionaire family. But in his arrogant, desperate greed, he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to execute a flawless, totally legal, hostile takeover. Because of David's $2 million theft, the Montgomery Group is now in default of our loan, I stated, turning back to face Jamal. The acceleration clause means we do not have to wait for the 5-year maturity date to collect our money. We can demand the immediate total repayment of the entire $500 million principal balance, and we can demand it right now. Jamal leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. Richard Montgomery does not have $500 million in liquid cash, Jamal said, a fierce grin mirroring my own. He is completely leveraged. If you trigger that clause, he will instantly default on the repayment. And when he defaults, Apex Holdings has the legal right to seize all of his collateral, which means I finished matching his energy. We get to seize the entire Montgomery Group. We get the South Bay project, we get their commercial high-rises, we get Brittany's trust fund, and we get the very house they just evicted me from. All because David could not stop gambling. This was no longer a simple game of suburban revenge. This was a financial execution. David had unwittingly wired the explosives directly to the foundation of his new family's empire, and he had handed the detonator straight to me. I walked back to the kitchen island and placed my hands flat on the cold granite surface. Draft the official notice of default, Jamal. Prepare the acceleration clause paperwork. Make sure our legal team has the foreclosure documents completely finalized and ready for my signature. Do not send anything to Richard Montgomery yet. I want them to remain completely blind for the next 48 hours. Jamal nodded, his fingers already flying across the keyboard to initiate the legal protocols. When do we drop the bomb? He asked, his eyes locked on the screen. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the penthouse window. We drop it on Saturday night, I replied coldly. Right in the middle of their precious charity gala. I want maximum exposure. I want the entire real estate industry to watch as Richard Montgomery loses his empire, and I want Brittany to know that her husband is the exact reason she is going to lose absolutely everything. The trap was perfectly set. Now it was time to tighten the noose. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in silent financial warfare. I did not leave the penthouse. Jamal and I ordered takeout, drank too much espresso, and orchestrated the systematic dismantling of Richard Montgomery's remaining financial independence. We had the kill switch with the $500 million mezzanine loan, but I wanted to ensure that when I pushed the button, Richard had absolutely no avenues of escape. No friendly banks, no alternative credit lines, and no secondary investors willing to throw him a lifeline. I wanted him entirely isolated and completely at my mercy. We need to create a liquidity crisis before we even trigger the acceleration clause, I told Jamal on Tuesday morning, staring at a complex web of Montgomery Group's smaller outstanding debts displayed across 3 different monitors. If we hit him with the big demand now, he might try to liquidate some of his performing suburban assets to stall for time. I do not want him to have that option. I want every single one of his properties locked down. Jamal nodded, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he navigated through a labyrinth of corporate registries and offshore banking portals. He already owes money all over town, Gwen. He has short-term bridge loans on 3 different commercial properties downtown, and a series of high-interest equipment leases for the South Bay construction site. None of them are individually massive, but combined they represent a significant cash drain. Buy them all. I commanded, my voice cold and decisive. Use the Delaware shell companies. I do not want any trace of Apex Holdings associated with these smaller transactions. I want it to look like aggressive anonymous hedge funds are suddenly taking an interest in distressed Montgomery debt. Jamal grinned, his eyes fixed on the screen. Initiating the acquisitions now. We are offering to buy the debt at a slight premium to current market value. These smaller lenders are going to be thrilled to offload Montgomery's risk. They will sign over the paper before lunchtime. By Tuesday afternoon, the trap was fully set. Through a network of 6 different untraceable shell companies, I now controlled not only the massive mezzanine loan keeping South Bay afloat, but also the mortgages on Richard Montgomery's primary commercial office building and the equipment leases for his construction crews. I had him completely surrounded, and he had absolutely no idea. I was the invisible hand slowly tightening the noose around his neck. The first signs of panic began to ripple through the Montgomery Group headquarters on Wednesday morning. Jamal, who had tapped into a network of financial whispers on Wall Street, monitored the fallout in real time. He is getting margin calls, Jamal announced, leaning back in his chair and taking a sip of his lukewarm coffee. The shell companies we used to buy up his commercial mortgages just executed standard risk assessment audits. They flagged the delays at South Bay and immediately demanded millions of dollars in additional cash collateral to maintain the loans. Richard's accountants are scrambling. I smiled, imagining the chaos unfolding in the sleek glass-walled offices of the Montgomery Group. Richard Montgomery was used to being the biggest predator in the room. He was used to bullying small contractors and leveraging his family name to get favorable terms. He had never faced a coordinated algorithmic attack from multiple anonymous institutional investors simultaneously. He probably thought it was just a string of bad luck or a sudden shift in market sentiment. He had no concept that it was a targeted personal execution orchestrated by the woman his daughter had just evicted. David is probably losing his mind right now, Jamal noted, pulling up a real-time feed of Montgomery Group's publicly traded bond prices, which were beginning to dip as rumors of their liquidity issues spread. As the senior vice president of acquisitions, he is the one who is supposed to be managing these lender relationships. Richard is definitely screaming at him to fix this. I leaned against the kitchen island, feeling a surge of dark satisfaction. David was arrogant, but he was not exceptionally bright when it came to complex financial maneuvering. He was a salesman who had married into money, not a strategist. He would be entirely out of his depth trying to negotiate with faceless corporate entities demanding immediate cash infusions. He would be sweating through his tailored suits, desperately trying to hide his $2 million embezzlement, while the entire company's financial structure crumbled around him. They are bleeding cash trying to meet these margin calls, Jamal confirmed, watching the data flow across his screen. Richard is draining their operational reserves just to keep the commercial properties from going into default. He is prioritizing the visible assets to maintain the illusion of stability. He is literally starving the South Bay project to save his office buildings. Exactly as planned, I said, crossing my arms. He is weakening his own foundation. He is spending all his available capital fighting ghost companies. By the time we drop the acceleration clause on the main $500 million loan, his accounts will be completely empty. He will not have a single dollar left to negotiate with. The beauty of the maneuver was its absolute invisibility. Richard and David were fighting a war against an enemy they could not see, an enemy they did not even know existed. They assumed it was just the ruthless, impersonal nature of high finance. They believed they were victims of bad timing and aggressive Wall Street algorithms. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that the architect of their destruction was sitting in a penthouse overlooking their city, watching their empire slowly suffocate. The silent checkmate was nearly complete. I had isolated them, drained their resources, and positioned my shell companies to block any potential escape routes. Now it was time to step out of the shadows. It was time to let them know exactly who was holding the axe. I looked at the calendar on my phone. The annual real estate charity gala was only 3 days away. I was going to give David one final terrifying warning before the public execution. I was going to look him right in the eye and let him realize that his absolute worst nightmare had just become a reality. The Oak Ridge Country Club was the epicenter of suburban elite posturing. It was a place where membership was a weapon and gossip was the ultimate currency. I pulled my sleek Aston Martin into the valet circle on Thursday afternoon, tossing the keys to a wide-eyed attendant. I was wearing a tailored emerald green suit that commanded attention, a deliberate departure from the muted, acceptable colors the club wives usually favored. I bypassed the ornate reception desk with the effortless authority of someone who owned the very ground they walked on. 10 seconds to spot my targets. They were sitting at a prime table near the edge of the patio, enjoying an expensive spread of seafood and crisp white wine. David, Brittany, and my parents were laughing together, a picture-perfect display of newly minted family unity. They were celebrating their perceived victories, utterly oblivious to the financial guillotine swinging directly above their heads. I navigated through the maze of wrought iron tables, my heels striking the stone floor with a sharp, rhythmic cadence. Conversations around me ground to a sudden halt as the country club regulars recognized the woman they had been viciously gossiping about all week. They expected to see a broken, evicted hoarder. Instead, they saw an apex predator. My mother was the first to notice my approach. Her polite fawning smile vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of sheer panic. She dropped her oyster fork, her hand flying to her throat as she desperately nudged my father under the table. My father looked up, his face draining of color. He shot me a furious warning glare, silently begging me to turn around and disappear. I ignored them entirely. I reached their table and stood perfectly still, casting a long, deliberate shadow across David's plate. "Hello, family," I said, my voice smooth and projecting clearly across the suddenly quiet terrace. "It is a lovely day for a celebratory lunch." Brittany slammed her wineglass down on the table, sloshing expensive Chardonnay over the rim. Her manicured hands gripped the edge of the table as she looked me up and down with utter contempt. "What are you doing here, Gwen?" she demanded, her voice loud and shrill enough to ensure every neighboring table could hear her performance. "Security is supposed to keep the riffraff out. I thought you would be busy digging through dumpsters for your next meal." My parents shrank back into their chairs, absolutely mortified by my presence, but entirely unwilling to defend me. David chuckled, leaning back in his chair and throwing his arm over the back of Brittany's seat. "Let her be Babe," he sneered, puffing out his chest. "She probably just came to beg for a handout." It is sad, really. I kept my expression completely neutral, allowing them to dig their hole as deep as they possibly could. "Please, Brittany, continue," I offered politely. "I am sure you have some wonderful news to share with the rest of the patio today." Brittany took the bait immediately. She stood up, tossing her blonde hair and raising her chin with maximum arrogance. "Since you asked, we are actually celebrating David right now. My father just officially named him the future chief executive officer of the Montgomery Group. He is taking over the entire empire. And that is not even the best part." She leaned across the table, her eyes gleaming with malicious joy. "Daddy just approved the demolition permits for that pathetic little suburban box you used to live in. The bulldozers are rolling in tomorrow morning. We are going to flatten your old house and pave it over to build a private championship-grade tennis court. I am going to practice my backhand right over the exact spot where your dining room table used to be. It is going to be incredibly therapeutic to erase your entire existence from that property." My parents nodded enthusiastically, desperately trying to validate Brittany's cruel boasting. They were actively cheering for the destruction of the home where I had hosted their holidays. I looked at my mother and father one last time, permanently filing away the image of their pathetic, sycophantic smiles. Then I dismissed them from my mind forever. I turned my attention entirely to the man sitting arrogantly at the head of the table. David was beaming, soaking in the praise and the power of his new title. He thought he was untouchable. He thought he was the absolute smartest man in the entire room. He had no idea he was already a dead man walking. I leaned forward, placing both of my hands flat on the edge of their pristine table. I ignored Brittany completely and locked my eyes directly onto David. I lowered my voice just a fraction, making it a razor-sharp blade meant entirely for his ears alone. "That is quite a promotion, David," I said, my tone laced with lethal calm. "But before you start picking out new office furniture and celebrating your newfound corporate kingdom, I have a very quick professional question for you." David smirked, totally oblivious to the profound danger he was in. "Go right ahead, ask your question." I tilted my head, keeping my gaze ruthlessly pinned to his dilating pupils. "Did you ever manage to patch that $2 million hole in the South Bay escrow account, David?" The color instantly vanished from his face. His arrogant smirk collapsed entirely, replaced by a look of profound, unadulterated terror. The air seemed to physically leave his lungs as his hands began to shake uncontrollably. He was suddenly unable to formulate a single coherent word in his own defense. I leaned in an inch closer, delivering the final crushing blow. "Because the SEC absolutely hates forged audits." The silence that followed my question was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that instantly sucked every ounce of oxygen straight out of David's lungs. I watched the arrogant confidence literally melt off his face, replaced by a pale and sickly shade of gray. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a ledge and realized there was no safety net waiting below. Brittany, completely oblivious to the financial catastrophe I had laid out, scoffed loudly and crossed her arms over her chest. "What on earth are you talking about, Gwen?" She snapped, her voice dripping with irritation. "David does not have any holes in his accounts. He is the senior vice president. You are just spouting desperate nonsense because you are jealous." David did not agree with Brittany. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his stiff collar. He abruptly pushed his chair back, the metal legs screeching harshly against the stone patio. He reached out his hand, trembling slightly, and grabbed me tightly by the elbow. His grip was entirely different from my mother's earlier pinch. It was desperate and panicked. "We need to talk." David choked out, his voice hoarse and unrecognizable. "Right now. Inside." Brittany let out an indignant gasp. "David, where are you going? We're in the middle of lunch." David ignored his new wife entirely. He dragged me away from the table, marching us through the heavy glass doors and into a secluded, dimly lit alcove near the private wine tasting rooms. Once we were out of sight from the patio, he released my arm and rounded on me like a cornered animal. The polished corporate facade was gone. He was sweating profusely, his chest heaving as if he had just sprinted several miles. "Are you completely out of your mind?" David hissed, his eyes darting frantically around the empty hallway to ensure no one was listening. "Where did you get those numbers? How do you know about the South Bay escrow accounts? Who have you been talking to?" I calmly adjusted the sleeve of my suit, brushing off the spot where he had grabbed me. "You really thought you could hide $2 million in unauthorized wire transfers?" I asked, keeping my tone conversational. "You routed the money through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, David. You listed them as construction consultants. Did you honestly believe that sloppy accounting would hold up against a legitimate forensic audit?" David took a step backward, physically recoiling. His eyes were wide with sheer terror. "You hacked the Montgomery Group servers," he accused, his voice shaking with fear. "That is corporate espionage, Gwen. That is a federal crime. I will have you arrested. I will destroy you." I let out a soft laugh. "Oh, David, you are in no position to threaten anyone with federal crimes. You stole $2 million from your father-in-law to pay off your underground gambling debts. You violated the core financial covenants of the South Bay mega project. You committed wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. The authorities are not going to be looking at me when this all comes crashing down. They are going to be looking directly at you." He ran a trembling hand through his styled hair. He was breathing heavily now, the panic fully taking over his nervous system. "Listen to me," he pleaded, his tone shifting from threatening to pathetic. "You cannot tell Richard. If he finds out about the missing funds, he will kill me. He will ruin my career, force Brittany to divorce me, and have me thrown in prison. You have to keep your mouth shut, Gwen. I will pay you. I will give you whatever you want. Just name your price." I looked at the man I had once shared a home with, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. He was offering to bribe me with the money he had stolen from his new family. It was poetic in its pure corruption. "You do not have anything I want, David," I replied smoothly. "You took the house. You froze my bank accounts. You let your wife spread vicious rumors about my mental health. You wanted to play the ruthless corporate shark. You wanted to show everyone that the strong eat the weak. Well, you are about to find out where you sit on the food chain." I stepped closer to him. I reached up my hands, moving toward his neck. David flinched, but I calmly grasped the lapels of his suit jacket. I smoothed the fabric out, fixing his collar just like a dutiful wife would do before her husband went into a meeting. It was the ultimate display of control, and he knew it. He stood frozen, terrified of the woman he had consistently underestimated for years. "You asked me where I got that classified corporate information," I whispered softly, ensuring he caught every single syllable. "The truth is, I did not have to hack anyone. As the majority shareholder of the private equity firm keeping your father-in-law from going bankrupt, I have full unrestricted legal access to every single ledger the Montgomery Group possesses. David stopped breathing entirely. His eyes bulged as the reality of my words slammed into his brain. "Check your email, David," I instructed, giving his lapel one final firm pat. "I just sent you a very important notification." I turned and walked away. I did not look back. Reaching the lobby, I heard it. A sharp buzz echoed from the alcove behind me. An email had arrived. It was the official acceleration clause notice from Apex Holdings. A second later, a man violently gasped for air. David had opened the message. He was hyperventilating, realizing he had just triggered the complete annihilation of his world. I pushed open the front doors and stepped out into the afternoon sun. The air tasted incredibly sweet. The Montgomery Group boardroom was a monument to corporate intimidation, 40 feet of polished mahogany surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. Usually it was a space where Richard Montgomery crushed competitors and dictated terms. Today, however, the air in the room was thick with panic, the atmosphere entirely saturated by the explosive shouting of a billionaire realizing his empire was actively burning to the ground. Richard Montgomery stood at the head of the massive table, his face a dangerous shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his custom-tailored collar. He slammed his fist down onto a thick stack of legal documents, the sound cracking like a gunshot in the cavernous room. Across from him, David sat rigidly in a high-backed leather chair looking physically ill. His usual arrogant posture had completely vanished, replaced by the hunched, defensive stance of a man desperately trying to avoid a physical blow. "Explain this to me right now," Richard roared, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "Explain how I just received an official legal notice from Apex Holdings declaring a catastrophic breach of our mezzanine loan covenants. Explain how they know exactly $2 million is missing from the South Bay escrow accounts." David swallowed hard sweat beading on his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning in the boardroom. "Richard, I don't know how they found out," he stammered, his voice trembling. "It was supposed to be a temporary reallocation of funds. I was going to replace it. I had a plan." "A temporary reallocation," Richard bellowed, his fury escalating to a terrifying pitch. "You didn't temporarily reallocate anything, David. You committed corporate embezzlement. You stole $2 million of my operating capital to pay off underground gambling debts. Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you even comprehend the magnitude of the disaster you just triggered?" Richard picked up the top document from the stack and threw it across the mahogany table. It slid to a stop right in front of David. "Read it," Richard commanded, jabbing a finger at the paper. "Read the acceleration notice that Apex Holdings just served us." David stared down at the crisp, legally binding document. The words on the page confirmed everything Gwen had whispered to him at the country club just an hour earlier. His hands shook so violently he could barely hold the paper steady. "Due to the unauthorized diversion of funds exceeding the covenant threshold," David read aloud, his voice cracking, "the lender hereby exercises its right under the acceleration clause. The entire principal balance of $500 million plus all accrued interest and penalties is due and payable in full." He stopped reading, looking up at his father-in-law with sheer terror in his eyes. "They want the entire $500 million," David whispered. "They want it all right now." "They want it in exactly 48 hours, Richard corrected him, slamming his hand on the table again. "Apex Holdings isn't just asking for their money back. They are executing a hostile takeover. They timed this perfectly. They bought up all of our short-term commercial debt over the last 3 days, intentionally draining our liquidity through aggressive margin calls. They made sure our operational reserves were completely empty before dropping this bomb." Richard began pacing the length of the boardroom, running his hands through his thinning gray hair. He was calculating the variables, desperately searching for an exit strategy that simply didn't exist. "They knew," Richard muttered more to himself than to David. "They knew exactly how leveraged we are. This wasn't some random algorithmic audit. This was a targeted assassination. Someone at Apex Holdings has been watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He stopped pacing and turned back to glare at David. And you handed them the executioner's axe on a silver platter. Your reckless, pathetic gambling addiction gave them the precise legal loophole they needed to bypass the 5-year maturity date and demand immediate repayment. We can fight this, David pleaded, grasping at straws. We can get our lawyers to file an injunction. We can claim the audit was illegal or that the clause is unenforceable. Are you completely brain dead? Richard shouted, advancing on David until he was looming directly over him. There is no fighting this. The covenants in that loan agreement are ironclad. You broke the law, David. You committed wire fraud using my corporate accounts. If we try to take Apex Holdings to court, they will simply hand over the forensic evidence of your embezzlement to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI. You won't just lose your job. You will go to federal prison for a very long time. David shrank back into his chair, the reality of the situation finally crushing the last remaining fragments of his arrogance. The comfortable, wealthy life he thought he had secured by marrying Brittany was entirely gone, replaced by the impending threat of criminal prosecution and complete financial ruin. What happens if we default? David asked, his voice barely a whisper. What happens if we can't pay them the $500 million in 48 hours? Richard let out a harsh, bitter laugh. What happens? He repeated, shaking his head in absolute disbelief at David's ignorance. If we miss that deadline, the cross-default provisions kick in across our entire portfolio. Apex Holdings has the legal right to seize all of our collateral. They get the South Bay mega project. They get the commercial high-rises downtown. They get the corporate headquarters. Richard leaned down, placing both hands on the arms of David's chair, trapping him in place. They also get my personal assets. Richard hissed, his face inches from David's. They get Brittany's trust fund. They get my private accounts. They even get that newly acquired suburban portfolio we just foreclosed on. The house you and Brittany were so thrilled about bulldozing tomorrow, Apex Holdings owns that too. They own everything, David. You didn't just destroy your own life. You bankrupted my entire family. The sheer totality of the destruction hung heavily in the boardroom. David stared blankly ahead, his mind completely unable to process the scale of the catastrophe he had caused. He had arrogantly believed he was a master manipulator, a corporate shark who could easily discard his worthless ex-wife and upgrade to a billionaire's daughter. He had confidently walked into Gwen's dining room on Thanksgiving, believing he held all the power. Now, sitting in the luxurious boardroom, he thought he would one day rule. David finally understood the terrifying truth. He wasn't a predator, he was just the bait, and the trap had snapped shut with devastating, inescapable force. The clock was ticking, and in exactly 48 hours, the Montgomery Empire would officially belong to Apex Holdings. The 48 hours passed with the agonizing speed of a slow-motion car crash. Saturday evening finally arrived, bringing with it the annual real estate charity gala. The event was held in the grand ballroom of the most incredibly opulent historic hotel, a venue dripping in gold leaf and illuminated by massive crystal chandeliers. Hundreds of the most powerful developers, investors, and media personnel in the Midwest were gathered under one single roof. Flashbulbs erupted near the red carpet entrance, capturing the arrival of the suburban elite. Valets rushed to park fleets of imported luxury vehicles. The expensive champagne flowed freely. Richard Montgomery stood near the main stage, wearing a bespoke tuxedo that suddenly felt entirely too tight around his thick neck. He was sweating profusely, dabbing his forehead with a silk handkerchief while forcing a rigid, unconvincing smile for the cameras. He was a desperate man backed into a lethal corner. With the mezzanine loan deadline officially expiring at 5 in the afternoon, his empire was technically already forfeited. But Richard was a stubborn predator who refused to accept his own slaughter. He had concocted a reckless, completely fraudulent plan to save his public image tonight. His strategy was pure desperation. Richard planned to take the stage and announce a massive fabricated merger with a major European conglomerate. It was a complete lie, a phantom deal designed solely to calm the panicked markets and artificially inflate his crashing bond prices. He hoped the grand public announcement would generate enough media buzz to scare Apex Holdings into backing off, or at least force them to the negotiating table before they filed the final foreclosure paperwork on Monday morning. He was betting his entire freedom on one last spectacular bluff in front of the press. While Richard tried to orchestrate his massive lie, David was rapidly unraveling at the far end of the ballroom. He stood glued to the open bar, aggressively downing his fourth glass of neat scotch in less than an hour. His hands shook so violently that the ice clinked loudly against the crystal tumbler. The tailored tuxedo he wore hung awkwardly on his frame. His posture collapsed under the crushing weight of impending federal prosecution. He kept darting his eyes toward the heavy mahogany doors, half expecting men in dark windbreakers to march in and publicly arrest him. Every time a waiter dropped a tray or a microphone shrieked with feedback, David physically flinched. He knew the fake merger plan was absolute garbage. He knew Apex Holdings had the forensic accounting files proving his $2 million embezzlement. The walls of the ballroom felt like they were closing in, suffocating him. He was trapped in a room filled with the very investors he had defrauded. He watched his father-in-law schmoozing with the mayor, sickened by the realization that both of their careers were already rotting corpses just waiting for the dirt to be thrown. In stark contrast to her husband and his terrified spiral, Brittany Montgomery was having the absolute best night of her entire life. She was completely oblivious to the financial apocalypse that had swallowed her family wealth just a few hours prior. She glided through the crowded ballroom in a breathtaking custom-designed scarlet gown that featured a dramatic plunging neckline. Resting against her collarbone was a staggering $5 million diamond necklace, a piece she had demanded her father buy her specifically for this event to prove her supreme status among the suburban country club wives. Brittany strutted past the ice sculptures and the caviar stations, demanding constant attention from the event photographers. She believed tonight was her official coronation as the undisputed queen of the real estate social scene. She firmly believed she had successfully evicted the pathetic ex-wife, secured a brilliant corporate husband, and cemented her place at the very top of the financial hierarchy. She paraded around the room, loudly mocking the outfits of women she deemed inferior, and deliberately spilling a drop of red wine on a passing waiter, just to watch him nervously apologize to her. "Oh, David, stop sulking in the corner like a depressed teenager," Brittany scolded, marching up to the bar and slapping his shoulder. She completely ignored the sheer terror written across his pale, sweating face. "You are ruining my photos. You are about to be announced as the heir to the entire Montgomery Group. Try to act like you actually belong in this tax bracket." She snatched his glass of scotch and placed it forcefully onto the counter, glaring at the bartender, until he quickly moved away to serve another guest at the opposite end of the long bar. David could only stare at her, his stomach churning with toxic dread. He opened his mouth, wanting to scream that the diamonds around her neck technically belonged to the woman she had kicked out on Thanksgiving. He wanted to shake her and tell her that her precious trust fund was currently valued at zero. But the words lodged in his throat, blocked by sheer cowardice. He simply nodded, adjusting his bow tie with trembling fingers, allowing his spoiled wife to drag him by the wrist toward the center of the room where the cameras were flashing the brightest. The string quartet playing softly transitioned into a lively, upbeat tempo, signaling that the main event was about to begin. The guests began to take their assigned seats at the massive floral-draped tables surrounding the main stage. Richard Montgomery wiped his brow one final time, straightening his posture as he prepared to deliver the most critical, fraudulent speech of his entire lifetime. The ballroom buzzed with wealthy ignorance, a room full of millionaires entirely blind to the fact that the floor beneath them was rigged to explode. The execution hour had officially arrived, and nobody could possibly stop the absolute devastation waiting just beyond the heavy wooden ballroom doors. I was already in the building, perfectly positioned to end their reign tonight. The heavy wooden ballroom doors swung open, and I stepped across the threshold, instantly commanding the attention of the entire room. I was wearing a breathtaking custom-made gown, crafted from midnight blue silk that caught the light of the crystal chandeliers with every movement. The dress was a masterpiece of architectural precision, featuring a sharp asymmetrical neckline and a sweeping train that announced my arrival with effortless authority. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, immaculate twist, and the only jewelry I wore was a pair of flawless diamond drop earrings. I did not look like a defeated, evicted suburban housewife. I looked like a woman who owned the building. As I glided down the carpeted steps toward the main floor, the lively chatter of the surrounding guests began to falter. Heads turned in my direction, eyes widening as the city elite tried to process the striking transformation of the woman they had spent the last few days viciously gossiping about. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, my gaze sweeping over the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns with absolute predatory calm. It took exactly 15 seconds for my parents to spot me from their table near the back of the room. I saw my mother drop her champagne flute, the glass shattering against the polished marble floor. She completely ignored the mess, grabbing my father by the sleeve of his tuxedo jacket. They abandoned their desperate attempts to network with mid-level investors and literally sprinted across the crowded ballroom to intercept me. Their faces were contorted with a mixture of sheer panic and furious embarrassment. They shoved past a group of local politicians, practically knocking over a tray of hors d'oeuvres, in their frantic rush to physically block my path before I could get anywhere near the Montgomery family. "Gwen, what on earth do you think you are doing here?" My mother hissed, her fingers digging viciously into my bare arm as she tried to drag me back toward the exit doors. "I told you specifically to stay away from this gala. You are going to ruin everything we have worked for." My father stepped directly in front of me, using his broad shoulders to shield me from the view of the VIP tables. "You need to leave this instant." He growled, his voice a low, aggressive whisper that trembled with absolute rage. "You are an embarrassment. Look at you parading in here in some rented dress, trying to pretend you belong in this crowd." Richard Montgomery is about to give his keynote speech, and if he or Brittany sees you, our logistics contract is entirely dead. Turn around and walk out the door before we have you forcibly removed. I calmly looked down at my mother's hand, which was still gripping my arm like a vice. I did not pull away. I simply stared at her fingers until the sheer coldness of my expression forced her to release her hold. "I am not wearing a rented dress, Dad," I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly modulated to carry just enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "And I have absolutely no intention of leaving. I have a ticket and I have business to conduct tonight." My mother let out a sharp, panicked gasp. "You do not have business here. You are a homeless, bankrupt dropout who cannot accept reality. You are acting like a desperate stalker." She turned her head, frantically scanning the perimeter of the ballroom until she spotted a pair of broad-shouldered security guards patrolling the entrance. "Officer," she called out, waving her hand aggressively to flag them down. "Officer, please come over here immediately. We have a serious problem." The head of security, a towering man with a severe expression and an earpiece, quickly navigated through the crowd and approached our tense standoff. "Yes, ma'am. Is there an issue?" he asked, his hands resting professionally on his duty belt. My mother pointed an accusatory finger directly at my chest. "This woman crashed the gala," she declared, her voice rising in pitch as she played the role of the concerned, victimized guest. "She is a desperate stalker who has been harassing the guests of honor. She does not belong here, and she is making everyone incredibly uncomfortable. I demand that you escort her off the premises right now before she causes a massive scene and ruins the entire evening." My father nodded emphatically, adjusting his tie to project an air of wealthy authority. "She is trespassing," he added, glaring at me with pure hatred. "Please remove her through the service elevator so the press does not see her." The head of security turned his gaze from my frantic parents to me. He looked at my face, then glanced down at his digital guest manifest tablet. My parents held their breath, waiting for the guard to grab my arms and drag me out into the cold night. Instead, the towering head of security immediately straightened his posture, took a respectful step backward, and offered me a deep, deferential nod. "Good evening, Miss Miller," he said, his voice ringing with absolute, unmistakable respect. "We have been expecting you. Everything has been prepared exactly to your specifications in the VIP lounge." My parents froze, their mouths hanging open in synchronized comical shock. Before either of them could formulate a single coherent word, a familiar figure stepped out from the velvet-roped VIP section and walked confidently toward us. Jamal looked immaculate in a custom black tuxedo, exuding the calm, undeniable power of a man who held all the financial cards. Around his neck hung a heavy gold-plated lanyard, displaying an all-access platinum sponsor badge, the highest tier of authority at the entire charity gala. Jamal stopped right beside me and offered a polite, devastatingly cool smile to my paralyzed parents. "Good evening," he said smoothly. "Our table is ready whenever you are." I linked my arm through his, leaving my stunned parents behind. The VIP section of the ballroom was an elevated tier separated from the main floor by velvet ropes and discreet security personnel. It offered a commanding view of the entire gala, a physical manifestation of the hierarchy that dictated this particular social circle. Jamal and I settled into a plush velvet booth near the center of the enclosure. The table was already set with crystal flutes and a chilled bottle of vintage champagne, exactly as my executive assistant had arranged. I sat back against the cushions, allowing myself a moment to simply observe the room from this new vantage point. Below us, the city's real estate elite mingled, completely unaware that the tectonic plates of their industry were about to shift violently. My parents had retreated to a corner near the back of the room, their faces pale and their postures rigid with anxiety. They kept glancing up at the VIP section, their expressions a mix of disbelief and mounting dread. They had spent the entire evening trying to distance themselves from the daughter they deemed a failure, only to watch her ascend to the very top of the social pyramid they so desperately wanted to climb. The irony was palpable, but I quickly dismissed them from my thoughts. They were no longer relevant to the narrative unfolding tonight. My focus shifted to the front of the ballroom, where the Montgomery family held court at the primary sponsor table. Richard Montgomery was engaged in an intense, hushed conversation with two men who looked like high-powered corporate attorneys. He repeatedly wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, his movements jerky and agitated. David was seated next to him, staring blankly at his empty glass, looking like a man awaiting a firing squad. And then there was Brittany. She was holding a fresh glass of champagne, laughing loudly at something a local politician had said, her scarlet gown standing out starkly against the sea of black tuxedos. She turned her head, her gaze sweeping across the room, and that is when she saw me. I watched the realization hit her. She stopped laughing mid-sentence. Her eyes widened, locking onto me, sitting comfortably in the VIP lounge. For a moment she just stared, trying to process the impossibility of the situation. The woman she had gleefully evicted, the woman she had smeared as a bankrupt, unstable hoarder, was currently occupying the most exclusive seating in the entire venue, flanked by a man wearing a platinum sponsor badge. The confusion on her face rapidly morphed into sheer, unadulterated fury. Brittany Montgomery was not accustomed to being upstaged, and she certainly was not accustomed to having her narratives challenged publicly. She viewed my presence in the VIP section not just as an insult, but as a direct challenge to her authority. I could almost see the gears turning in her mind as she calculated how to reassert her dominance. She abruptly excused herself from her conversation, her grip tightening around the stem of her champagne flute. She began marching toward the stairs leading up to the VIP area, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. Her posture was rigid, her chin tilted upward in that familiar pose of supreme arrogance. She was coming to create a scene to publicly humiliate the intruder who dared to enter her territory. Jamal noticed her approach. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his demeanor entirely relaxed, but profoundly alert. "Here comes the princess," he murmured, his voice smooth and conversational. "She looks like she is ready to throw a tantrum." "Let her come," I replied softly, taking a sip of my own champagne. "I want everyone to see exactly who she is." Brittany reached the velvet ropes and flashed a condescending smile at the security guard stationed there. "I need to speak to that woman," she demanded, pointing directly at me. The guard, recognizing her as the daughter of the guest of honor, hesitated for a fraction of a second before unhooking the rope to let her pass. She stormed up the short flight of stairs, her scarlet gown billowing behind her. As she approached our booth, she deliberately raised her champagne glass, the liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Her intention was glaringly obvious. She planned to accidentally trip, spilling the sticky, bubbling liquid all over my custom silk gown, creating a spectacle that would force me to leave the gala in absolute disgrace. It was a petty juvenile tactic, but entirely in character for someone who relied on public humiliation to maintain her status. "Gwen, what a surprise!" Brittany exclaimed loudly, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, meant to draw the attention of the surrounding VIP tables. "I had no idea they let people like you into this section. Did you sneak past security?" She took a sudden, exaggerated step forward, feigning a stumble. Her arm shot out, the champagne glass tilting downward, aiming the contents directly at my lap. Jamal moved with terrifying speed and precision. He did not stand up. He simply reached across the table, his large hands snapping out to intercept her wrist mid-spill. He caught her arm firmly, his grip unyielding, stopping the glass just inches from my dress. The champagne splashed violently against the inside of the flute, a few drops spilling onto the polished table, but my gown remained completely untouched. Brittany gasped, her eyes flying wide in shock as Jamal held her wrist suspended in the air. "Excuse me," she sputtered, her face flushing with indignation. "Let go of me." Jamal released her wrist smoothly, leaning back into the velvet cushions with a calm, dangerous smile. "My apologies, Mrs. Montgomery," he said, his tone perfectly polite, but layered with unmistakable warning. "You seem to lose your balance. We would not want you to ruin such a beautiful evening with a careless mistake." Brittany snatched her hand back, rubbing her wrist angrily. She glared at Jamal, then turned her furious gaze back to me. "You do not belong here, Gwen," she hissed, dropping the sweet facade entirely. "You are a pathetic, bankrupt loser who cannot even afford a place to live. You probably rented that dress with the last few dollars you had. You are an embarrassment to this entire event." The surrounding tables had fallen completely silent. Several prominent investors and city officials were watching the exchange with rapt attention. This was the exact audience I wanted. I set my champagne flute down on the table, the crystal clinking softly against the glass surface. I looked up at Brittany, allowing a profound, chilling pity to wash over my features. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke clearly enough for every single billionaire in the immediate vicinity to hear perfectly. "You should really be more careful with your drinks, Brittany," I said, my voice smooth and resonant. "Because this dress is worth more than your father's entire remaining net worth." The words hung in the air, sharp and lethal. Brittany let out a harsh, incredulous laugh, her eyes darting around to ensure everyone had heard my supposedly delusional claim. "You really are insane," she mocked, her voice shrill. "My father is a billionaire. He owns half this city." I tilted my head, looking at her with absolute, unwavering certainty. "He did," I corrected softly. "But as of 5 o'clock this afternoon, he doesn't own a single brick. And neither do you." Brittany stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The absolute certainty in my voice had finally pierced her thick armor of arrogance. She looked down at Jamal, then back at me, searching for any sign of a bluff. Finding none, her face flushed a blotchy, uneven red. She spun around, nearly tripping over the hem of her expensive scarlet gown, and fled down the stairs of the VIP lounge. She was retreating to find her father and demand answers. I calmly picked up my champagne flute and took a slow, satisfying sip. The prelude was officially over. The main event was about to begin. A grand orchestral fanfare filled the massive ballroom, silencing the murmurs and signaling the start of the evening's formal program. The heavy velvet curtains on the main stage parted, revealing a massive digital projection screen that displayed the golden crest of the Montgomery Group. The master of ceremonies, a local television anchor with a booming voice, stepped up to the podium. He delivered a brief, flattering introduction about urban development, community partnerships, and visionary leadership. Then he raised his hand toward the sponsor table. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the man of the hour, the Chief Executive Officer of the Montgomery Group, Mr. Richard Montgomery. The ballroom erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Richard Montgomery stood up, buttoning his custom tuxedo jacket with hands that visibly trembled. He forced a broad, charismatic smile onto his face, waving to the crowd as he made his way up the carpeted steps to the stage. He stepped behind the acrylic podium, gripping the edges tightly enough to turn his knuckles white. The bright stage lights illuminated the heavy sheen of sweat coating his forehead. He looked out over the sea of wealthy investors, local politicians, and media personnel. He was a man standing on a trapdoor, desperately pretending he was standing on solid ground. "Thank you." Richard began, his voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate another incredible year of growth and prosperity. As I look out at this magnificent gathering, I am reminded of the strength and resilience of our great city. I am also incredibly proud to announce that the Montgomery Group has just concluded its most profitable quarter in our entire corporate history." A ripple of impressed applause washed over the room. I watched from the VIP section, leaning forward slightly. He was lying through his teeth to hundreds of people committing securities fraud in real time to save his own skin. Our South Bay mega project is proceeding ahead of schedule. Richard continued, his confidence artificially inflating as he fed on the crowd's approval. The leasing numbers are breaking regional records, but we are not stopping there. Tonight, I am thrilled to announce that we are in the final stages of a massive, unprecedented merger with a premier European consortium. This partnership will bring billions in new foreign investment directly into our local economy and solidify our position as the undisputed leader in commercial real estate. He paused, waiting for the applause to swell. He raised his hands, soaking in the admiration. It was a spectacular, desperate performance. He was selling them a phantom ship while his own boat was actively resting at the bottom of the ocean. "And I owe so much of this recent success to my brilliant team," Richard said, gesturing toward his table. "Specifically, I want to recognize my new son-in-law and our incoming Chief Executive Officer, David." Right as he spoke David's name, the sound system emitted a sharp, ear-piercing screech. Several guests in the front row flinched, covering their ears. Richard tapped the microphone, leaning closer. "Testing," he muttered, trying to maintain his charming smile. "Testing 1, 2. The microphone was completely dead. His voice no longer carried past the first row of tables. Richard looked off stage, gesturing frantically at the audio-visual technicians. He tapped the microphone harder, his panic bubbling back to the surface. Then the giant projection screen behind him flickered. The golden crest of the Montgomery Group glitched, fracturing into horizontal lines of digital static. The image twisted, warped, and vanished entirely, replaced by a blinding, stark white screen. The ballroom plunged into a confused, nervous murmur. Guests exchanged bewildered glances. Richard turned around, staring up at the blank screen in total horror, his fraudulent speech completely derailed. I stood up from my velvet booth. Jamal mirrored my movement, his expression sharp and focused. The timing was absolutely flawless. I walked out of the VIP lounge and descended the carpeted stairs. The crowd parted automatically as I moved through the main floor. The midnight blue silk of my gown caught the stage lights, drawing every single eye in the room. Whispers swept through the tables as the elite guests recognized the woman who was supposedly a bankrupt, evicted suburban outcast. My parents, still trapped near the back of the room, watched with open mouths as I glided directly toward the main stage. I did not look at them. I kept my gaze locked on the sweating, terrified man standing behind the podium. I reached the side steps of the stage and walked up, the sound of my heels echoing in the sudden heavy silence of the ballroom. Richard Montgomery took a step back, his eyes darting wildly. "You?" he hissed, his voice raw and completely unamplified. "What are you doing up here? Get off my stage right now. Security." Security did not move. Jamal stepped out from the shadows of the wings, completely bypassing the frantic hotel staff. He walked across the stage with measured, confident steps and handed me a sleek wireless microphone. I took the microphone, offering Jamal a brief nod of thanks. I stepped to the very center of the stage. I looked at the crowd. "My name is Gwen," I said. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings." The collective gasp that rippled through the grand ballroom was a physical wave of shock. Hundreds of the most powerful investors and politicians in the city sat frozen in their tailored suits and expensive gowns. They stared at me with unblinking eyes. I stood at the center of the stage, bathed in the bright spotlight. I did not look at the stunned audience. I turned my head and locked eyes directly with Richard Montgomery. He was gripping the edges of the acrylic podium so tightly his knuckles were completely white. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths. He was actively hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically between me and the silent microphone resting uselessly in his trembling hands. Down at the primary sponsor table, David looked as though the floor had just vanished beneath his feet. His face was devoid of all color, his jaw hanging slack in absolute horror. He finally understood the fatal magnitude of his arrogant mistakes. I raised the microphone, my voice ringing out with crystal-clear precision across the cavernous room. "The man standing beside me just told you a very compelling story about record profits and a phantom European merger," I announced, letting my words echo over the silent crowd. He painted a beautiful picture of corporate strength. But in the world of high finance, numbers do not lie, and grand speeches cannot patch massive holes in a sinking ship. The truth is far less glamorous. The Montgomery Group is not experiencing unprecedented growth. They are drowning in an ocean of toxic liabilities. And as of 5 o'clock this evening, the Montgomery Group officially defaulted on a $500 million mezzanine loan. They are completely and irreversibly bankrupt. Pandemonium erupted across the ballroom. Investors leaped from their velvet chairs, pulling out their phones to desperately check their portfolios and call their brokers. Shouts of disbelief and anger filled the air. Richard lunged forward, waving his arms frantically to silence me. "This is a lie!" He bellowed, his voice raw and cracking without the amplification of his dead microphone. "She is a fraud. Do not listen to her." I did not even flinch. I simply gestured to Jamal, who was standing quietly in the wings of the stage. Jamal pressed a single button on his tablet. The massive digital projection screen behind me flared to life. It did not show the golden crest of the Montgomery Group. Instead, it displayed a crisp, undeniable legal document bearing the bold seal of Apex Holdings. It was the formal notice of default, complete with the executed acceleration clause and the hostile takeover filings. The evidence towered 40 feet high for every single person in the room to scrutinize. I turned back to the audience, my voice cutting through the rising chaos like a perfectly sharpened blade. "You do not have to take my word for it," I stated calmly. "The foreclosure documents are currently displayed behind me. The legal filings have already been submitted to the state and federal regulatory agencies. The Montgomery Group no longer controls its own assets. Apex Holdings has formally seized all commercial properties, all ongoing construction projects, and all operational accounts to satisfy the delinquent debt. The mighty empire you were just asked to applaud has been entirely liquidated." Richard collapsed backward, falling heavily into a chair set up for the panel discussion. He buried his face in his hands, the reality of his total financial annihilation finally breaking his spirit. But I was not finished. The true architect of their destruction still needed to be held accountable in front of the very people he had tried to impress. I walked to the very edge of the stage and looked directly down at David. He tried to shrink back into his chair, desperate to hide from the spotlight of my absolute vengeance. Many of you might be wondering how a seemingly stable real estate conglomerate could trigger such a catastrophic default without any warning. I continued, ensuring my gaze remained pinned to my former husband. The answer is sitting right there at the sponsor table. The man Richard Montgomery just introduced as his brilliant new heir and incoming chief executive officer is the sole reason this entire company is burning to the ground tonight. The murmurs in the crowd shifted from panicked to viciously curious. I projected my voice to the furthest corners of the room. David, operating as the senior vice president of acquisitions, secretly embezzled $2 million directly from the operational escrow accounts of the South Bay megaproject. He siphoned corporate funds through fraudulent shell companies in the Cayman Islands to pay off his massive underground gambling debts. That unauthorized diversion of capital constituted a direct fatal breach of the strict financial covenants keeping this company alive. His greed and sheer incompetence handed my firm the exact legal right to demand immediate repayment of the entire $500 million loan. The screen behind me shifted again. Jamal displayed the forensic accounting trails, highlighting the specific wire transfers, the fake vendor invoices, and the offshore routing numbers. The irrefutable proof of David's corporate felony was broadcast for his father-in-law, his peers, and the press to witness. The fallout was immediate. Men in expensive suits pointed accusatory fingers at the Montgomery table. David sat paralyzed, visibly trembling, as his entire professional and personal life was systematically shredded in front of a live audience. He had traded me for a golden ticket, only to realize he had purchased a front-row seat to his own public execution. I slowly scanned the terrified front row until I found the unmistakable flash of a scarlet gown. Brittany Montgomery stood absolutely frozen near the base of the stage. I looked down and offered her an empty smile. "Oh, and Brittany," I said, my voice ringing with brutal, flawless clarity. "I am going to need the keys to my house back. Apex Holdings owns that too." The ballroom instantly descended into absolute and unmitigated chaos. My final words echoed off the gilded ceiling and shattered the last remaining illusions of the Montgomery empire. It was as if I had thrown a live grenade directly onto the primary sponsor table. Hundreds of wealthy investors, politicians, and media personnel erupted simultaneously. The polite, refined atmosphere of the charity gala evaporated in a single second, replaced by the vicious, frantic energy of a Wall Street trading floor during a catastrophic market crash. Men in expensive tuxedos were literally shouting over one another, frantically pulling out their cell phones immediately. They were desperate to pull whatever capital they could salvage out of the sinking Montgomery ship. The noise level in the room became absolutely deafening. Down at the front table, Richard Montgomery was completely broken. The sheer weight of his total financial annihilation physically crushed him. His knees buckled, and he collapsed backward into his velvet chair with a heavy, defeated thud. His face had drained of all color, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He stared blankly at the massive projection screen behind me, his eyes wide and vacant, as he processed the irrefutable proof of total ruin. The billionaire titan of suburban real estate was gone, replaced by a hollow, broken man who had just lost his entire legacy in front of the entire city. He clutched his chest, his breathing shallow and rapid, but nobody rushed to his aid. His former allies and sycophants were too busy scrambling to distance themselves from his toxic fallout. Brittany stood paralyzed at the base of the stage. Her scarlet designer gown suddenly looked less like a royal coronation dress and more like a massive, glaring target. The arrogant sneer she had worn for months had completely melted away forever. It left behind a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She looked around the panicked ballroom, watching the elite social circle she desperately craved actively turn their backs on her family. She finally understood that her trust fund, her status, and her unearned power were completely erased. She opened her mouth to scream, to hurl another insult, or to demand that security arrest me, but no sound came out. She was entirely powerless. While Richard collapsed and Brittany froze, David chose the only tactic he had ever truly mastered. He chose to run. I watched from my high commanding vantage point. I watched my former husband slowly back away from the sponsor table. His eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal searching for a weakness in a cage. He saw the angry glares of the defrauded investors pivoting toward him. He knew that the moment the initial shock wore off, the crowd would demand immediate physical answers for his $2 million embezzlement. He did not wait for the mob to descend. David turned on his heel, keeping his head down, and began shoving his way aggressively through the frantic, swirling crowd of panicked guests. He abandoned everyone there. He abandoned his new wife and his ruined father-in-law without a single backward glance. He shoved a waiter aside, sending a silver tray of champagne glasses crashing to the polished marble floor. The shattering glass barely registered over the roar of the furious ballroom. I tracked his pathetic flight path perfectly. He was heading straight for the heavy brass doors that led to the private service corridors, desperate to find the back exit of the hotel. He wanted to slip away into the cold Chicago night and disappear before the legal consequences of his massive corporate felony hit. I did not alert security to stop him. I simply watched him run, knowing exactly what was waiting for him at the end of his desperate sprint. David burst through the service doors and stumbled into the brightly lit sterile hallway of the hotel kitchen. The sudden quiet of the corridor was a sharp contrast to the deafening roar of the ballroom. He leaned against the tiled wall, gasping for air, his chest heaving under his soaked tuxedo shirt. He ripped the silk bow tie from his neck and tossed it onto the floor, his hands shaking violently in pure terror. He thought he had escaped the public execution. He thought he had outsmarted the system one last time. He pushed himself off the wall and sprinted down the long corridor toward the heavy metal doors that marked the loading dock exit. He slammed his weight against the push bar, shoving the metal door open and stumbling out onto the concrete loading dock. The freezing November wind hit him instantly, but he did not care. He was outside. He was free. Or so he completely believed. "Going somewhere, David?" A smooth, deep voice called out from the dark, shadowy exterior corner. David froze in his tracks. He slowly turned his head, his eyes adjusting to the dim, amber light of the street lamps. Standing perfectly still at the bottom of the concrete ramp was Jamal. My brother-in-law looked completely relaxed, his hands resting casually in the pockets of his custom tuxedo trousers. He wore a calm, triumphant smile that radiated absolute authority. But Jamal was not standing there alone. Flanking Jamal on either side were two imposing individuals wearing dark windbreakers with stark yellow letters printed across the back. They were federal agents specializing exclusively in corporate financial fraud crimes. They stepped forward into the light, their expressions entirely devoid of sympathy. Jamal stepped forward and calmly handed a thick, heavily bound folder directly to the lead federal agent. "This is the complete forensic accounting file," Jamal stated, his voice ringing with professional clarity. "It is the undeniable proof of the corporate embezzlement executed by the suspect standing right in front of you." The agent pulled heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. David collapsed against the metal door, utterly defeated. Local news cameras suddenly flooded the alley with blinding light, capturing every pathetic second of his highly public corporate arrest. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted David's terrified face in alternating colors of absolute ruin as they shoved his head down into the back of the squad car. He was gone, erased from the board entirely. But the execution of the Montgomery family was not quite finished. The sun rose over the Chicago suburbs the following morning, casting a pale and freezing light over the sprawling house that Brittany had so proudly claimed as her own just a few days prior. The air was crisp, quiet, and completely merciless. Inside the master bedroom, Brittany Montgomery was living a waking nightmare. Her designer mascara was violently smeared across her pale cheeks, leaving jagged black streaks that ruined her perfectly contoured face. The scarlet gown from the charity gala lay crumpled in a pathetic heap on the hardwood floor, discarded in her frantic hysterical rush to understand the catastrophic collapse of her entire universe. A heavy synchronized pounding echoed from the front door downstairs. It was not a polite knock, it was a demand. Brittany flinched, clutching a silk robe tightly around her trembling shoulders. She stumbled down the grand staircase, her bare feet slipping slightly on the polished wood. When she pulled the heavy oak door open, she did not find friendly neighbors or apologetic country club wives offering sympathy. Standing on the front porch was a highly coordinated, imposing team of private security contractors hired directly by Apex Holdings. They wore immaculate black suits and carried heavy, legally binding foreclosure documents. The lead security officer, a stern woman with a clipboard and absolutely zero patience stepped forward and handed Brittany a crisp white envelope. This property is now under the exclusive ownership and direct control of Apex Holdings, the officer stated, her voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. You have exactly 1 hour to pack your personal belongings and vacate the premises. If you do not comply, we are legally authorized to remove you and your items by physical force. Brittany let out a shrill, completely unhinged scream. You cannot do this to me! She shrieked, her voice cracking as tears of pure panic streamed down her ruined face. My father is Richard Montgomery. He owns this entire development. He will have you all fired and thrown in jail. The security officer did not even blink. Richard Montgomery is currently filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in federal court, the officer replied coldly. He does not own this development. He does not own the company. He does not even own the car parked in your driveway. You have 59 minutes remaining. Panic finally overrode Brittany's blinding arrogance. She sprinted back up the stairs, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. She tore through her massive walk-in closet, violently dragging Louis Vuitton suitcases down from the top shelves. She began haphazardly throwing designer dresses, diamond jewelry, and expensive handbags into the luggage. Her hands shook so badly she could barely close the zippers. She was hyperventilating, completely unable to process the absolute destruction of her privileged reality. She needed an escape plan. She needed a luxury hotel suite where she could hide from the media and figure out her next move. She grabbed her phone with trembling fingers and dialed the concierge desk of the most exclusive 5-star hotel downtown. When the receptionist asked for a credit card to secure the presidential suite, Brittany confidently rattled off the numbers of her unlimited platinum card. A torturous silence stretched over the phone line. I apologize, Mrs. Montgomery, the concierge said, his tone polite but firm. Your card has been declined. Brittany scoffed loudly, wiping a tear from her cheek. Run it again, she demanded aggressively. That account is linked directly to my trust fund. It has no limit. The concierge paused for a second before delivering the fatal blow. We have run it 3 times, ma'am. The issuing bank has permanently suspended the account. We cannot accommodate your reservation today. Brittany dropped the phone onto the bed, her mind spinning into sheer chaotic terror. Her trust fund was gone. The unlimited wealth she had wielded like a weapon her entire life had simply vanished into thin air. Desperate and terrified, she dialed her father's private cell phone number. It rang once before diverting immediately to an automated voicemail service. Daddy, pick up the phone. Brittany sobbed hysterically into the receiver, pacing the length of the bedroom like a caged animal. Apex Holdings sent security guards to the house. My credit cards are not working. David is not answering his phone. You need to fix this right now. Please call me back immediately. But Richard Montgomery was never going to call her back. He was barricaded inside a windowless conference room surrounded by federal bankruptcy lawyers and frantic accountants, desperately trying to shield himself from impending criminal charges and absolute financial ruin. He had no time, no money, and no power left to save his spoiled daughter from the consequences of his arrogant greed. The hour expired with ruthless precision. The private security team marched up the stairs and flanked the master bedroom door. Your time is up, the lead officer announced, stepping aside and gesturing firmly toward the staircase. It is time for you to leave immediately. Brittany grabbed the handles of her 2 oversized designer suitcases. She dragged them clumsily down the stairs, the heavy wheels thudding loudly against the wooden steps. She walked out the front door, the exact door she had kicked open on Thanksgiving to evict Gwen. The security team immediately stepped forward, pulling the heavy oak door shut and locking the deadbolt with a loud final click. Brittany Montgomery stood completely alone on the edge of the cold concrete curb. The freezing Chicago wind whipped through her thin silk robe. She shivered violently, staring blankly at the sprawling suburban house that no longer belonged to her or her ruined family. Her precious daddy's money was entirely gone forever. I stood in the center of my downtown penthouse, savoring the absolute immaculate silence of a Sunday morning. The chaos of the past 48 hours had completely settled, leaving behind a perfectly clear horizon. I was holding a steaming cup of black coffee, watching the morning light reflect off the towering glass skyscrapers of Chicago. Brittany Montgomery was currently standing on a freezing suburban curb with nowhere to go. David was sitting in a federal holding cell waiting for an arraignment that would inevitably end his career forever. Richard Montgomery was trapped in a financial labyrinth he would never escape. The hostile takeover was totally complete and the dust was finally settling. The soft chime of my private intercom interrupted my peaceful solitude. I pressed the button on the marble wall panel. "Good morning, Thomas," I said, addressing the head concierge of my building. "Miss Miller." Thomas replied, his tone laced with professional hesitation. "I apologize for the interruption. You have two visitors in the lobby. They claim to be your parents. They are highly distressed and are demanding to speak with you immediately. Should I have security escort them off the premises?" I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling a familiar hollow anticipation. They had seen the news. They knew the Montgomery Group was entirely liquidated, which meant their desperate logistics contract was dead in the water. "Send them up, Thomas," I instructed calmly. "Let them through." I walked over to the heavy oak doors of the private elevator and waited. A few moments later, the doors slid open with a soft chime. My parents practically stumbled into the marble foyer of my penthouse. They looked absolutely pathetic. The arrogant, condescending posture they had worn at my Thanksgiving table was completely gone. My mother's eyes were red and swollen from crying, her expensive silk scarf twisted nervously between her shaking hands. My father looked 10 years older, his shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of his impending bankruptcy. They stared at the sprawling $5 million penthouse, taking in the panoramic views, the custom artwork, and the undeniable proof of the massive wealth I had built entirely without them. "Gwen," my mother gasped, rushing forward with her arms outstretched as if she intended to hug me. "Oh, my beautiful, brilliant girl, we have been trying to reach you all morning. We saw the financial news on the television. We saw what you did to the Montgomery family." I took a deliberate step backward, keeping my hands wrapped firmly around my coffee mug. "Do not touch me," I commanded softly. Her arms dropped instantly. She looked at my father silently, begging him to intervene. "Gwen, please," my father pleaded, his voice cracking with artificial emotion. "You have to understand the position we were in. We were just trying to protect the family business. But we always knew you were special. We always knew you were going to achieve incredible things. We are so incredibly proud of you." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "You were so proud of me that you allowed another woman to throw an eviction notice onto my dining room table. You were so proud of me that you explicitly banned me from a charity gala and officially disowned me over the phone. You only discovered how special I am when you realized I own the company you were begging for a bailout." My mother began to openly weep, burying her face in her hands. "We were wrong," she sobbed loudly. "We made a terrible mistake. But you are our daughter. We are family, Gwen. The Montgomery deal is completely dead. Our logistics company is going to default by Friday. We are going to lose our house. You have to help us. You are the only one who has the capital to save us now." I watched them beg, feeling absolutely nothing. There was no anger left, no sadness, and certainly no desire for reconciliation. The emotional bond had been permanently severed the moment they chose Richard Montgomery's money over their own daughter. I turned around and walked over to my solid mahogany desk, sitting near the floor-to-ceiling windows. I opened the top drawer and pulled out a leather-bound checkbook. I grabbed a silver fountain pen. My parents watched me, their eyes wide with sudden, desperate hope. They believed blood would secure a financial rescue. They thought my success was their safety net. I quickly filled out the date and signed my name at the bottom. In the amount box, I wrote a highly specific, extremely deliberate number. I tore the crisp paper from the booklet and walked back over to where they were standing in my foyer. My mother reached her hand out, a relieved, tearful smile breaking across her face. "Thank you," she whispered gratefully. Thank you, Gwen. I did not hand the check to her. Instead, I held it out between my thumb and index finger, and I simply let it go. The small piece of paper fluttered through the air and landed face up on the polished marble floor. My father looked down at it. His expression of relief instantly morphed into sheer, unadulterated shock. $200, he choked out, staring at the number written on the check. This is for exactly $200. What is this? That is the exact amount you gave me when I was struggling to pay for college, I stated coldly. You told me to figure it out myself. Now I am telling you to do the same. We share DNA, but we are not family. I pressed the intercom button. Thomas, please send security up to remove these guests. My parents wept openly as two guards escorted them out of my home forever. Jamal and Rachel walked into the room. Jamal poured 3 glasses of scotch. We stood looking out over the city skyline. I did not just survive the betrayal. I bought the building. Fade to black. The story we just explored, featuring a woman who faced the ultimate humiliation when her ex-husband and his entitled new wife attempted to evict her on Thanksgiving, offers a profound lesson in resilience, composure, and self-worth. When confronted with blatant cruelty and the heartbreaking betrayal of her own parents, Gwen did not resort to screaming, begging, or matching their toxic emotional energy. Instead, she chose the path of silent, calculated strength. The most critical takeaway from this narrative is that your value is never dictated by those who underestimate, belittle, or abandon you. Toxic individuals, whether they are former partners or blood relatives, often use public humiliation and emotional manipulation to maintain a false sense of superiority. They thrive on eliciting a chaotic emotional reaction because it validates their perceived power over you. However, true strength lies in absolute composure. By walking away in silence and focusing entirely on her own capabilities, the protagonist demonstrated that you do not need to prove your worth to people who are fundamentally committed to misunderstanding you. Furthermore, the story powerfully highlights the absolute necessity of setting ironclad boundaries. Moving forward and finding peace do not require keeping toxic people in your life just because you share a history or DNA. You are entirely allowed to protect your emotional well-being, build your own chosen family, and permanently cut ties with those who view your existence merely as a stepping stone for their own selfish ambitions. Real success is not just about financial victory or a spectacular public reckoning. It is about reclaiming your narrative and realizing that you are the sole architect of your destiny. If you are currently dealing with people who constantly diminish your worth, stop fighting for a seat at their table and start building your own empire today.